I want to look really quickly at a problem passage because this gets brought up an awful lot in these discussions. It's the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And maybe to recap it kind of quickly, it's a story that Jesus tells, which may or may not be a parable. That's debated. But what Jesus seems to be doing here, he tells a story about a rich man who gets to live the kind of life he wants. He's obviously wealthy. He's got anything that he could want. He lives in a nice house. And there's a poor man named Lazarus, a beggar, who sleeps outside of his gates and is just really not doing well for himself. And both men die. And the rich man goes to Hades. And Lazarus goes to what's called the bosom of Abraham. So Abraham, the great forefather of the Jewish people, comforts Lazarus, whereas the rich man is in Hades. And the rich man is in this kind of place of fire, and he asks that Lazarus would come and bring him water. And he's told that there's this great divide between them, and Lazarus can't pass through it. And the kind of, I guess, punchline of the story, there's a couple parts. The rich man says, "Well, could Lazarus at least go warn my brothers about this, or could they be warned about this fate that could come to them?" And Abraham says, "Well, they have Moses and the prophets. They've got the Hebrew Bible to warn them. If they're not going to listen to that, and then seeing a man rise from the dead to come and tell them this message is not going to change their mind or put them on the right track." And so the punchline, of course, the joke is that those who try to persecute Jesus, the leaders, the religious leaders in Jerusalem, have the prophets, they have the law of Moses, they still don't believe Jesus, and then they kill him, and then he comes back from the dead, and they still don't believe. And so that's kind of the foreshadowing of the story of the rich man and Lazarus. So as we're looking at this passage, we have some questions we need to ask. First of all, is this story a parable? Because if it's a parable, then the details might not actually be describing what Hades is really like, right? And there are good reasons to think that it is. First of all, it's in a collection of parables. There's other parables right around it. And it also starts, as many parables do in Luke, with this language of a certain man. There's a certain man who does this, a certain man who does that. And so it fits that bill. It also parallels other popular stories. There's a first century Egyptian story about a man named Setme, who's a rich man who dies and sees a poor man dressed in his elegant clothes by the side of the god Osiris. That's very similar, right? So perhaps Jesus is borrowing from popular stories of the day that were maybe known to bring home a point that he wants to make about the greed and spiritual dullness of the Judean leaders. So that he's not really necessarily teaching about what happens when you die. He's really making another point about the greedy and spiritually dull leaders of Jerusalem. Here's another question asked that's pretty important. How is this passage relevant to final punishment? Because those who believe in eternal conscious torment use it an awful lot to sort of say, well, this annihilationism thing sounds nice, but what about the rich man and Lazarus? And I would argue that those on the eternal conscious torment side are barking up the wrong tree here. This passage is not describing what happens at the final judgment. It's describing a pre-final judgment existence. So if it tells us anything about the biblical view of the afterlife, it's describing the intermediate state between death and resurrection. Because remember, the Bible teaches a future judgment and a bodily resurrection. So for that reason, I would say it's not directly relevant to questions about final punishment, and we should be really careful how we use it to develop a biblical doctrine of hell.